This message is on divine ironies in the book of Esther, dealing with Esther chapters 8 through 10. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. The book of Esther is a book full of ironies. It's the story of one of the greatest stories of salvation in the history of God's people. And yet God is never actually mentioned in the book. And the last three chapters of Esther bring the story of God's salvation for the Jews from Haman's attempted genocide to a conclusion, and explains the origin of the Feast of Purim. The Feast of Purim is in chapter 9, where that's established. And then chapters 8 through 10 deal with the final acts of Esther and Mordecai in completing the deliverance that was introduced earlier. Let's start with the irony of Purim. Purim is a secular holiday, but nonetheless is also a part of the Jewish religious calendar. Some of the verses that are relevant in Esther chapter 9, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into days of celebration. He wrote them to observe these days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration. They had begun doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his son should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur. Because of everything written in this letter and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join with them should, without fail, observe these 2 days every year in a way prescribed at the end, at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family, and in every province, and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. Now, Purim itself is an ironic Jewish festival. Lots of ironies in it. In the story, sorrow had been turned to joy. Jewish sorrow and mourning under Haman's threatened annihilation was turned into joy and celebration after deliverance, as 9:22 says. Fasting had turned into feasting. Jews had been fasting and presumably praying in anticipation of the terrible days that were to come, but this fasting had turned into feasting and gift giving, also mentioned in verse 22. Haman's plot had backfired. His plot to destroy the Jews had come upon his own head. So instead of killing the Jews, he ended up being killed as a result of his attempt to kill the Jews. The date of the planned destruction is ironic too. The very date that Haman's lot had determined for destroying the Jews, that date was determined by Lot itself to be the day that they would celebrate Purim. And so it's divinely ironic in that it gave Esther and Mordecai enough to have enough time to counter Haman's plot. And now they're going to celebrate the deliverance of the Jewish people on the very date that would have been their destruction. Now, Purim is the only Jewish holiday determined not by the command of God, but by the decree of man, namely the decree of Mordecai and Esther in a book which, interestingly enough, is devoid of any mention of God. And for that reason, Purim is considered by Jews that still practice Purim a secular, non-holy holiday. There's lots of eating and drinking and gift giving, and they do plays, they do masquerading. While up here at the beginning, there was a picture of a Haman hat, which is a food that they eat. But there was not much religious about the celebration of Purim. It's primarily secular. About the only religious thing that they do read the book of Esther itself, the Megillah, in the synagogue during the days of Purim. As a matter of fact, the secular nature of Purim is emphasized in the Talmud, which is the Jewish tradition about how to keep the laws and Jewish traditions. But in the Talmud, it is written that on Purim feast, there was to be a lot of drinking, even to the point of drunkenness. In Megillah, section 7b, verses 7 and 8, Rabbah said a person is obligated to become intoxicated with wine on Purim until one does not know how to distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed be Mordecai. And when I was a student at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, I lived in the dorm for 2 years before I eventually married. And when I was still living in the dorm, it was on Purim that I saw a rabbinic student who kept this rabbinic saying literally. He was inebriated. He was kind of wandering down the hall, bouncing from one wall to the other, trying to find his room on the night of Purim. He was so drunk he couldn't distinguish between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordecai. Now this raises a theological question. Is it right to have a religious celebration not explicitly commanded by God? I don't know whether you're aware of this, but the Puritans under Oliver Cromwell, after the Puritan Revolution that overthrew the monarchy in England, they tried to abolish Christmas for the very reason that this was not a celebration commanded by God. Now, you may or may not be aware, but Christmas is in December, not because that's when Christ was born. Christ was born probably in the springtime when shepherds kept their flocks by night on the fields. but it's celebrated in December, possibly because it began as a Christian alternative to pagan celebrations in December, such as ones associated with the god of war, Saturn, and or the sun god Sol, celebrating the winter solstice. And again, there's no command in the Bible to celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Is it legitimate for us as Christians to celebrate the birth of Jesus on a day not commanded by God? Well, this celebration of Purim by the Jews suggests that it might be okay to celebrate a holiday, a holy day even if it's not explicitly commanded by God. And we can celebrate other holidays like Flag Day and Memorial Day and the 4th of July and Thanksgiving and so on and so forth, even though they're not commanded by God, but we can celebrate them in the light of what we know about God and in praise of what God has done for us through the place where we live. And so it might be okay, just as Purim was okay for Jews to celebrate, even though it was not explicitly commanded by God. But now let me move to the ethical irony of Esther, Mordecai, and the Jews here at the end of the book. And for sake of time, I need to summarize some of the material in chapter 8. So let me go over the story of chapter 8 just very briefly. In chapter 8, Haman having been hanged, Ahasuerus gave Haman's house to Esther and Haman's royal office and signet ring to Mordecai. And then Esther got Ahasuerus to allow her to issue a decree in the king's name, allowing, quote, the Jews who are in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. In other words, on the day that Haman had him issue a decree to destroy the Jews, here the Jews are being allowed to defend themselves. And since Persian decrees were irrevocable, this was his way of revoking it. Well, you can attack them, but they can, attack you and kill you back. And that would hopefully keep anybody from killing anybody. And then it also said that Mordecai, the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them when he came to wear Haman's robes. And the Jews rejoiced throughout the Persian Empire at Esther's decree in chapter 8, 16, and 17. Meanwhile, interestingly, many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews for fear of the Jews had come upon them. They declared themselves to be Jews because they were afraid of the Jews killing them. And now we'll read a little bit more of the text in Esther chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse had occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those that sought their harm. And no one could stand before them, for fear of them had fallen upon all peoples. And all the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout the provinces. For the man Mordecai became more and more powerful. And the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon and Aspathoth, and I'll not read all the other names here. The 10 sons of Haman, the sons of Hamad Datha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. And the king said to Esther in Susa, the capital, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and also the 10 sons of Haman. What shall you have? What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. And so the king commanded this to be done. And the Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hand on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and got relief from their enemies, and they killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but laid no hand on the plunder. The irony in Esther of Esther and Mordecai. The book of Esther is full of ironies, and there's plenty of ironies in the book up until this point regarding Esther and Mordecai. For example, their hiding of their Jewishness. It's ironic that Mordecai told Esther to hide her Jewishness in chapter 2, presumably to avoid persecution and to maximize her chance of becoming queen. But Mordecai brought threat of genocide on the Jewish people by not hiding his Jewishness when he refused to bow down to Haman in chapter 3. So then ironically, at the end of the story, Esther was only able to save the Jewish people by revealing her Jewishness and opening herself up to becoming a victim of the genocide. Another irony, from sackcloth to royal garb. When Mordecai became aware of Haman's plot of genocide against the Jews, he fasted wearing sackcloth and ashes. But then later, Haman himself is commanded to clothe Mordecai in royal garments. So from sackcloth to royal garb. And then you have Esther's use to fasts and feasts. There's an irony. When Esther became aware of the plot to destroy the Jews, she commanded that there be a fast for the Jews, presumably also with prayer, though it doesn't say such. But to address the plot, she declared a feast, in fact, 2 feasts, for Ahasuerus, also called Xerxes, and Haman in chapter 5 and chapter 6. So ironically, she uses both fasts and feasts for her purposes. You have the irony of Haman's misinterpretation when the king wanted to reward someone, having ironically not been able to sleep the night before when Haman was coming to have Mordecai hanged. Ironically, Haman thought that the man that he would want to honor would be himself, and so said that such a person should be dressed in royal robes and paraded throughout the city. And then to his chagrin, he is forced to dress Mordecai in royal robes and parade Mordecai throughout the city. And then Haman had come to lift up Mordecai. Ironically, he wanted to lift him up on a pole on gallows, but ended up lifting him up in the sense of exalting him. And then there's the irony of Esther's disobedience. You might remember at the beginning of the story, Vashti was punished and deposed for disobeying the king's command to appear before him. But in Esther's case, Esther is twice rewarded for the capital offense of disobeying the king's command, which the command is not to appear before him unless he summons. She appeared before him anyway, and she was rewarded for her disobedience, whereas Vashti was punished. And then you have an irony involving Ahasuerus. When Ahasuerus asked Esther, when Esther revealed that there has been this threat against herself and the Jewish people, he asked, who is this dastardly person who sold Esther's people into destruction in chapter 7? And the irony is that though what Esther said is true, that Haman is the person, ironically, it was Ahasuerus or Xerxes himself who had issued the decree, a fact that Esther discreetly chose not to remind him of. You also get role reversals. Esther was pleading for her own life in Esther chapter 7, but as a result of pleading for her own life, that leads to Haman pleading for his life. Another role reversal, he who wanted to kill a Jew because he would not bow down to him ended up bowing down to a Jewish woman to keep from being killed. And then finally, you have Haman being executed for the wrong crime. In begging for his own life, in a passage that in chapter 7, and begging for his own life, Haman ended up groveling on Esther's couch, perhaps lying on Esther's legs as she leaned back away from him, making it look as if he were forcing herself on her when the king re-entered the room. And that ironically led to Haman's being pronounced condemned and to be executed. So that he was ultimately executed, not so much for the crime that he did commit, his attempted genocide, but for a crime that he had not in fact committed, attempted violation of Esther. More ironies. Haman is built gallows to hang Mordecai on, but ends up being hanged on his own gallows. Another role reversal, the killing. Those who look forward to destroying the Jews ended up being killed by the Jews. There's just all kinds of ironies all the way up into chapter 8. And therefore, it should not be surprising if we have yet more ironies in chapters 8 through 10. And so let me go over some of the ironies in chapters 8 through 10, many of which also involve role reversals. You have the irony of Haman's fall resulting in Mordecai's rise. Mordecai ends up in Haman's high position, receiving Haman's property and signet ring, chapter 8 and verse 2. You have Esther going through an unexpected, ironic metamorphosis. She goes from being the submissive, obedient daughter to an aggressive, even a manipulative monarch, using her feminine charm and cunning to manipulate the king, to execute Haman and slaughter the enemies of the Jews. Now, when you look at the characters of Esther and Mordecai, there are certainly things that are commendable, things that are worth emulating. Esther certainly did work to save the Jewish people, and ultimately she had the courage to risk her own life by identifying with her people and intervening for them in a way that allowed them to be saved from that plot that Haman had put forth and had convinced Xerxes to administer. And the text is also very positive about Mordecai at certain points. For chapter 10 and verse 3, for Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. You might describe Mordecai as an example of a law-abiding, good citizen Jew. He's willing to be different, especially in Mordecai's refusal to pay homage to wicked Haman, assuming that was based on the immorality of such act rather than Mordecai's own pride, though that's not totally clear. And Mordecai's rise to power certainly allowed him to help God's Old Testament people, the Jews, who were mostly under Persian authority in those days. But I want to throw in a note of caution about biblical characters. My note of caution is this, that just because a biblical character did something doesn't necessarily make it right. And my example is Samson. If you read in 1 Samuel chapter 16, 1 through 3, you find that Samson did a heroic feat. He was in the city of Gaza, and he picked up the city gate of Gaza, lifted it up on his shoulders, and carried it up into the hills. But then you might ask the question, well, why was it that Samson was in Gaza? Well, it turns out that he was in the city of Gaza to visit a prostitute, it says in verse 1. And interestingly enough, the biblical narrative here, like many biblical narratives, records what happens, but doesn't bother to make a condemnatory aside saying that what Samson did was morally wrong. But we can judge that what Samson did was morally wrong based on biblical teaching elsewhere, where that kind of irresponsible sexual behavior of visiting a prostitute has to be condemned as wrong. You have to judge the actions of a character in a narrative by moral teaching outside of that character, the clear moral teaching, say, in biblical law for the Old Testament state, or the moral teaching throughout the Bible for us as Christians. And again, we can't assume that just because a biblical character did something, that it was morally right. To which I now raise the question, did Esther and Mordecai do right, or did Esther and Mordecai do wrong? And there have been certain readers, among whom are Martin Luther, who have found what Esther and Mordecai did at the end of the book morally problematic. Luther called it much pagan bad behavior. So let me give you the case, first of all, that what Esther and Mordecai did for the Jews was morally right, and the case that perhaps what they did was morally problematic. On the idea that it was morally right, well, they defended themselves. They had the right to do that. They took no plunder, it said at several points. The vengeance was limited to the enemies who hated them, not just people in general. And unlike Haman's decree, it looks like they may have only killed the men and not the women and children. At least there's no mention of the women and children in those verses being killed. But on the other hand, there is a pretty strong case that can be made that what they did was morally problematic. And here I am influenced by an article by Stan Goldman, who wrote some years ago an article on ethical ironies in Esther, where he makes the case that what they did was not morally correct. So let me give you that case. We might start with the verse we've read before in chapter 8 and verse 16. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Now, this, by the way, is another note of irony, that as a result of Haman's attempt to destroy the Jews, that you ended up with more Jews or more people calling themselves Jews. Now, did these people declare themselves to be Jews because they'd come to believe in the Lord, the God of Israel? Well, I don't think so. They did it because fear of the Jews had fallen on them. In other words, they were doing it out of being terrorized by being killed by the Jews. They were so afraid of being killed by the Jews that they, quote unquote, converted. It's like when European Jews often professed to be Christians back in centuries past in order to avoid persecution by Christians. It had nothing, they had nothing to do with Haman's plot to kill the Jews, but they were terrified of being killed by the Jews. Moreover, so in this case, you have Persians who turn themselves into Jews. There's a possibility that Goldman points out that the Jews start to look like Persians. They arguably acted more like Persians. It said the Jews struck down their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In doing this, were they not acting more like Persians and religious Jews? Did they do this at God's command? Well, there's certainly no mention of God in the entire book, certainly not of God commanding them to do these things. The text is silent about God commanding them to do these things. Moreover, it may be understandable for an oppressed people to respond in kind, but is it right? Does that justify it? So were they acting more like Persians? You might ask the question, where's the biblical teaching that vengeance belongs to the Lord? Where is the biblical teaching about mercy and the biblical teaching about love of enemies? Why was it even necessary? Did not the decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves already in effect revoke the irrevocable decree of Xerxes to destroy the Jews? Why extend the slaughter for an extra day so that they could kill another 300 of their enemies? A good case can be made, and Goldman makes it, that this is not self-defense. This is a gratuitous slaughter. And so Stan Goldman sees an ethical irony in these role reversals. Jews the oppressed have now become Jews the oppressors. Shy, innocent, beautiful girl Hadassah has now become Esther, the tyrannical Persian queen, extending the slaughter an extra day to eliminate yet more of her enemies. In effect, Esther has become Vashti, and Mordecai, politically and morally, has become Haman. The purpose, according to Goldman, was to provoke in the reader, cognizant of the ethical traditions of the Pentateuch, a kind of moral reflection. The events at the end of Esther prove that Jews are by no means a superior race, but can act, especially when they leave God and his Torah out of the picture, they can act just like pagans, just like the Persians in this particular case. And hence, the book ends with an ethical, ironic twist. The slaughter here is not meant to be glorified in or to justify Jewish revolutionaries or to justify the modern Israeli tit-for-tat retaliation against terrorists. but is to caution Jewish and Christian readers against moral pretentiousness. The absence of God in the text illustrates the problem. The absence of God's name in the book may be the author's way of indicating that the Jews here, while used by God, were generally acting apart from God by pure human initiative without consulting either him or his word. Hence, a book which begins with satire against the Persians, the silly decree making husbands the master of their own households, ends with an ironic twist against Jewish pretentiousness to moral superiority. And even though God used them, Esther and Mordecai and the Jews fall short of biblical standards, all as an inadequate appreciation of God and his Torah. Let me review some of the problems morally of Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai broke the spirit of the Jewish law by working to make Esther marry a pagan king and having her hide her Jewishness along the way, a mark of worldliness and a spirit of assimilation. The Jews break the letter of the law by killing Haman's sons for the crime of their father. Because according to the law in Deuteronomy 24:16, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one must be put to death for his own sin. The killing of Haman's sons for Haman's crime is a breach of biblical law. And again, you have to ask the question, where is God and his word in the lives of Esther and Mordecai? There's certainly a hint of God's providence and working in and behind the scenes of the book. There's allusions to prayer in the book in conjunction with fasting, though, so interestingly, it doesn't mention prayer, only fasting. But an emphasis on God's revelation and guidance are completely lacking in this book. In the end, I believe that Esther and Mordecai, and I'm agreeing with Goldman on this point, are not models of spirituality, but rather are worldly Jews who became married both literally and figuratively to pagan Persian culture, and at the end act more like pagans than like Jews. So what's the lessons of this part of Esther? I would have to ask you the question. If you were appointed to a high office in Washington, maybe even become the president, how much would you change Washington, and how much would Washington in turn change you? It's impossible to serve two masters, God and Ahasuerus, as it were. It might not be totally impossible. It's not easy, and it's certainly unlikely. If you were the president, would you govern wisely in accord with God's word? Or would your loyalty to political party, your identity group, and the need to fill in and work with non-Christians cause you to sink down to the moral and ethical swamp of Washington and just become a worldly politician like everybody else? Don't think so quickly in the light of what happened to Esther and Mordecai that you would be much different than the other people that were already there. Nonetheless, there is an encouragement here that God can and does use flawed leaders. If I'm right that Esther and Mordecai did wrong at the end and went to excesses morally, it's nonetheless true that God used them to save his people. And that encourages us that, God has to use flawed people to do his work. You might even be able to use flawed people like you and me, even though some of us may be a little bit on the worldly side, to accomplish his purposes. And then finally, in terms of Purim, we can be reminded that it is okay to celebrate even holidays that are not necessarily commanded by God. And it's always good to celebrate how God preserves a remnant of his people. Now, if we do have any kind of a position of authority, we need to be careful that we're following God and his word throughout so that we don't become just like the worldly people that we're among. But we are reminded that throughout this, God is providentially working, even despite human flaws. And even as the last days approach, as the times become perilous, as persecution of Christians may become ever so great, we can be reminded that God is going to be faithful to his people and will preserve his remnant for himself. Well, this is my presentation on the book of Esther, and my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.